go down to Megara, and live out the rest of his life. But these famous speeches that Plato puts in that dialogue says what? Socrates indicates to his old buddy Crito, I can't leave. The city is like my parent, my mother, my father. The laws of the city have reared me, protected me, cultivated me. I can't betray them now. I can't run away. I'd rather die than do this. So he dies. And that's the kind of commitment, folks, that you find back in the ancient city-state. There was a tremendous commitment. There were exceptions, of course. Alcibiades, folks, has no loyalties other than loyalty to Alcibiades. Alcibiades is a snapshot of later modern Western politics, folks. You know, take care of me, and I'm going to have a very fluid response to morality, situational ethics, etc., etc., etc. But most of the Greeks, folks, as I said, were very sacrificial in their orientation. You all know the word liturgy, I assume, right? Now, we know it from a religious context. But the word liturgy originally, folks, meant folk work or folk contribution. The 300 richest clans, richest families in Athens, folks, had to voluntarily, quote unquote, voluntarily step forward and make massive public contribution on behalf of the welfare of Athens. For example, Athens lived by its navy, right, folks? Lived by its navy. Very expensive to outfit a navy. At one point, the Athenians had as many as 400 triremes. Very, very expensive. The state did not pay for these triremes, folks. Every year they had to be refitted, crews had to be hired, and captains had to be secured, or the founder of the liturgy could man the ship himself. But it took a tremendous amount of money, folks, and these are people called triarchs, as from trireme. And these are the guys who went into their own pockets and financed the outrigging and the hiring of the crews and the training of these crews for the ships. This was not publicly financed. It was all done based on folk contribution on the part of the rich. And most of the rich did not complain about this. They saw it as their civic duty. There were no tax exemptions here. You know, we have philanthropists today, folks, but I wonder how many philanthropists we would have today if they didn't have a CPA whispering in their ear about the advantages of being philanthropic. Well, that was not an issue back in these days. These guys make contribution because it's the right thing to do for their polis, for their city-state. Most of the jobs that were done politically, now this is a participatory democracy. This is a very labor-intensive democracy. Almost none of these jobs were salaried. They made their contribution to serve in a court or to serve in an assembly. They got very, very meager pay to be a juryman, folks. They got, you know, a half a drachma a day. That's about half of a salary, half of a day's wage. Most of these jobs were not remunerated to any significant degree, and people just went and did their work. The estimates, according to some scholars, is a Scandinavian scholar by the name of Hansen. And Hansen estimates that out of the 40,000 citizen population, at any given time during a year, folks, about 15,000 people were actively involved in politics. 15,000 people or more. This is not a republic. The word republic means a representative democracy. This is not a republic. This is a direct democracy. Direct because the citizens do the work themselves. They don't complain. They don't look for an excuse to get out of serving on a jury, like we all do. They don't demand pay. They say, yeah, I'll do the job, and but let me negotiate the fee. That just wasn't done here. People just stood up, went and did their job on an annual basis, and then if their name was drawn again out of the urn, folks, next time around, they went and did it all over again. This was by sortition, right? Sortition means lottery. That's how almost all of these jobs were filled, folks, by sortition. A couple of jobs where there were several high-powered sort of technical requirements, like accounting, for example. These jobs are actually paid, and some of these positions are actually elected. I'll say more about that as we go along. Now, what about the issue of public accountability? This is an important question for a democracy, right? Because, well, I mean, if you stop and think about it for a minute, democracy is based upon a very fair degree of trust. You got to trust your fellow citizen to do the right thing in a democracy. This system works or fails based on trust. Well, what did the Greeks do? How did the Greeks organize this? What was their approach to accountability? The Greeks are very cynical about human nature, folks. Very cynical. I assume some of you know the name Acton, the British scholar, folks, late 19th century. He was actually a British publicist, newspaper man, social commentator. This is Lord Acton, A-C-T-O-N. Acton is responsible for that famous quote. He says, "Power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely." That is a perfect summary, folks, of the Greek attitude toward human nature and its potentials for abusing power. Okay? They are very cynical about this. One of the 7 wise men of ancient Greece is a fellow by the name of Bias, B-I-A-S. Bias said this, 2 things, famous things. One, he says, most men are bad. Very terse observation. Most men are bad. And then the other point, folks, is this. He says, office shows the man. In other words, if you want to figure out what type of human being you're dealing with, invest the person with some power and then stand back and take a look. He will reveal himself to you very rapidly, folks, in how he uses his power. Most people, the Greeks were convinced, folks, will abuse their authority. That's one of the reasons why we need rule of law, by the way, right? Law is the protection. Law is our salvation. Law is our shield against the abuse of power, folks, that tends to infect every human soul. Okay? Inside of every Greek, folks, this is what they also say about the ancient Greeks. Inside of every ancient Greek, folks, there's 2 types of people. They're anarchists. Every Greek is an anarchist. No Greek wants to be told what to do. Right? This is still true today, folks. I mean, you know, you go and look at Greek politics today. I mean, the Greeks are anarchistic. I mean, that's their spirit. That's part of their soul. The second thing, folks, is inside of every Greek soul, there's a tyrant waiting to come out. You don't want to be governed by anybody, folks, but you do want to govern. You want to be in charge, but you don't want anybody else to be in charge. This is the reason why the Greeks went to great lengths, folks, in setting up a system of accountability, which by every modern standard can only be described as ferocious. Ferocious. They went to great, great lengths to make sure that all public officials remained on very, very short leashes, folks. First of all, there was a debate that went on in our country a few years ago, and we've unfortunately lost track of this debate. It's a very important question politically for America, which we simply have shelved, and it's a bad thing that we've shelved this. But we did have a debate a few years ago in the United States, and this pertained to the U.S. Congress. We talked about term limitations. Remember this discussion, folks? Term limit. Now, the reason why it's good to have term limitations is because the shorter the time spent in legislative institutions like the U.S. Congress, if you have a fixed number of years maximum that you can stay there, the less likelihood there will be of public officials lying in bed with special interest groups. That's the biggest single problem we have in the United States legislature today. The thing that is a cancer inside of the U.S. Congress, folks, is interest group politics. You would greatly contract the ability of the interest groups, folks, to buy and to corrupt public officials if there were strict term limitations. The Greeks had absolute term limitations. Most of the jobs, 95% of the positions, folks, that the Greeks handed out could only be held by a citizen once in their lifetime. Some jobs you could repeat, but never in successive years. You'd have to be out of the loop for 2 or 3 years, and then maybe you could have a second term, folks. Okay? The only exception to that, folks, is, and I'm going to say something about them in a minute, are the strategoi. This is the generals, the strategoi. Okay, so we have very rigidly imposed term limitations. That's one thing in terms of accountability. Secondly, if you became a candidate for a job, you were constantly subject to public scrutiny. And I mean constantly. The first scrutiny, folks, is a thing called dokimasia in Greek. Dokimasia, which is the pre-examination for eligibility. Pre-examination. In other words, before they actually installed you in the job, they wanted to make sure you were morally fit for the position. So there was a public hearing about your candidacy. The kind of questions they asked you, folks, were these. Did you pay your taxes? Have you maintained the tombs of your ancestors? Have you cared properly for your mother and your father? Have you educated your children? If the answer to any of those questions, folks, is no, you're not suitable for the job. You're discounted. You're out. You suffer a degree, folks, of atemia in Greek, which means a shaming, a denial of your political right. Okay? Once you've held your job, at the end of your one-year tenure, there's another examination called the euthina. And this is, again, a public accounting. If you had anything to do with money, they check the books, you're audited, in other words. And at these public hearings, folks, I said these are open to anybody, any fellow citizen can stand up and launch an accusation against you that would trigger a full-blown investigation by the state against the charges brought. Anybody.